keep doing daily videos on YouTube, I need to raise my Patreon and Subscribe Star income to a grand total of $200 a month. So if you're so inclined, help a chap out. Zang. Hello lovelies, it occurs to me that since I'm running Dragon Warriors, it might be a good time to do a review of it. Now I'm wearing the eye patch in penance because Dave Morris, the co-creator of Dragon Warriors, expected me to during the streamed game last night, but I didn't. I was wearing it at the start when we were having some technical difficulties that I didn't realise, and by the time we went live properly I'd taken the patch off because it was annoying. So here I am in penance wearing it. So, Dragon Warriors. It is a quintessentially British old school RPG that was published in paperback format rather than the sort of more traditional sort of size that we see RPG books published at. It was very British, very old school. I think it was 83, 84, 85 it was published, and it was a set of books. Each one introduced new rules, new ideas, even new statistics that expanded on the game. So it's almost like it was designed to introduce these new elements to you as you went along, so you could get a basic grasp of the game from the first book, then that would be expanded on, and then that would be expanded on. But at each level it was also playable and came with a few adventures that you could indulge in, and this was a really interesting approach, I felt. And it was also trying to sort of cash in on the choose your own adventure books. Dave Morris and Oliver Johnson had also worked on single player choose your own adventure books such as Bloodsword. By the Bloodsword series, this one's Doomwalk. Unfortunately, I don't have many others of those. It's a format I wish would come back. I also wish it would come back for science fiction novels, the kind of small paperback pocketbook sort of thing. Always really appealed to me. There's something inherently handy about it, and when you've gotten used to lugging around, massive 300-page hardbacks, this looks like a good prospect. So it's a fantasy game. It's old school. But it's probably the least D&D derivative of the old school games. I think sort of from that period. The statistics and so on are relatively familiar and rolled in similar ways. But once you get outside of that, there's not really a lot to compare it to something like basic D&D from the time. It's a class and level system, but your level, while it expands your capabilities, makes you stronger, tougher, more capable, and so on, the changes are so incremental that it retains that sense of peril and of engagement and care and tactics that the first 3 to 6 levels of D&D typically do, but it retains that later on, and it means that the adventures that there are, the monsters that there are, retain a level of threat over a much broader space of gameplay time, of leveling up, than they do in typical class and level RPGs. So you get improvement as you go along. You get better at attacking, better at defending, better at seeing, you get access to more magic and so on. But a lucky goblin can still really fuck you up, even at high level. This also means, of course, that monsters tend to die fairly quickly, but that's not necessarily a problem of any sort either, really. It keeps combat swift, it keeps it deadly, and it really sort of pounds that idea into you that you need to be cautious, that you need to use tactics to be sure of carrying the day without too many casualties. And there isn't really a lot of healing magic or potions and so on available to you. It's it's a relatively low magic setting, despite the existence of mystics and sorcerers and elementalists and demonologists and all the rest of it. The way it mostly works is in terms of oppositional statistics, and these are mostly determined by your class, modified if you have certain high statistics. So, for example, you have attack, which is opposed by defense. You take the opponent's defense away from your attack, and that's what you have to roll under on a d20, so low rolls are good. And most other statistics in the game, the ones that you use most of the time, work in a similar way. So you have an evasion score, which is used against the speed of an attack, typically magic or traps or that sort of thing. You have perception and stealth, which are in opposition to each other, obviously. That works the same way. So, yeah, attack versus defense, speed versus evasion, and stealth versus perception, all on a d20. It's kind of wibbly-wobbly on other kinds of tests and rolls. In the adventures, it often changes the kind of thing that they choose from one thing to another, but typically it kind of skips unnecessary rolling and tests by saying if you have, say, a reflexes of 14 or over, you can walk across this beam without any problem, but if you've got under that, then you'll need to roll on a d20 under your statistic. Poisons sometimes go against your maximum health points or your current health points to see whether you've been poisoned or not by whatever it is that you've come into conflict with. So rather than having a central unified mechanic beyond the oppositional stuff, it does tend to go scattershot to more old school individual rules for things like picking locks, or particular abilities might default to percentages or might default to stats. There is a strength to that approach in that you can tailor rules to particular circumstances, but there is also a weakness in that it's harder to learn, and it means that there's all kinds of different things going on. Your mileage may vary. I tend to prefer the more unified mechanics that we see now, but it wouldn't be hard to shift that or change that in some way. Magic users, there's a variety of different ways that magic can be used. You can make pacts, which is where the demonology comes in. That's kind of a class-independent thing. Sorcerers, elementalists, and warlocks, which are like fighter mages, they have magic points, which I've always preferred over memorization. And mystics have a thing called exhaustion. So each time you cast a spell, you have a chance of becoming exhausted and no longer having access to your spells. But mystics are compensated for by having access also to a suite of mystical abilities that aren't magic per se and don't exhaust you when you use them. They got limited use, but the mystic kind of fulfills the role of cleric, I suppose, though there's no differentiation when it comes to healing magic. Sorcerers can cast healing magic, no problem. Combat's interesting, armor's interesting. In the default game, weapons have a set amount of damage that they do, normally. So a dagger or something might do 2 or 3 damage, normally. And they do have a dice associated with them, but that dice is to roll to get past armor. Armor doesn't have a huge span of capability or of protection. Basically ranges from 1 to 5, from sort of soft cloth armor through chainmail up to full plate mail. And this can negatively affect your character if you're not particularly trained to use it. Knights are the only ones that they start with plate armor and fully trained up on how to use it. So that's kind of interesting. So when you attack with a weapon, you don't by default roll for damage, you roll to get past the armor. So if their armor value is 5 for full plate mail and you're using a weapon that has a d8, you would need to roll 6, 7 or 8 to get past the armor and do damage to them. Shields are a little cumbersome. You would think they might sort of add to your defense total or something, but they don't. What you get instead is a shield save. So if a strike hits and potentially gets past your armor, you have a sort of last-ditch effort to deflect it with your shield by rolling a d6. If you get a 1, you deflect the blow. So that's kind of stepping aside from the main sort of d20-oriented system and does something different. There's a class and level system, like I said. There are knights and barbarians, each of whom have a different sort of fighting style. They're very basic, easily graspable characters. They are tanks, but not perhaps to the extent that you might think. They're not that much tougher than anybody else. It's mainly their capability with arms, training, and armor that really sets them apart. And it does make a big difference in this game, especially given how relatively limited magic users' capabilities are. You really have to pick how you use your spells. There's the sorcerer, who's a more sort of classic wizard, and as they advance in level they get access to scrolls and potions and staves and wands and all of that kind of thing. It takes a considerable investment of time and effort as a sorcerer to really sort of fully exploit these things. And there's lots of times that are ones with mystical significance from old fairy stories and things, like a year and a day or 40 days and 40 nights, that sort of thing when it comes to enchantment and brewing potions and all the rest of it. Mystics are kind of wandering psychics. There's a connotation of religion to it, but it's not overly strong. You could see them as monks. You could see them as just psychics or local wise people who are born with the sight or the touch or whatever it is. They're kind of nebulous, which is actually quite good because they make good sort of fill-in characters for all kinds of other things. There's elementalists who are a little bit needlessly complex, but they have power over the raw elements and they can channel the raw element or cast spells that relate to that element or to its neighbouring elements at a lesser level. So if you're a fire mage, you're not going to have access to water powers, but you might have access to earth and air spells. And there's an additional element called darkness, which if you take that as your primary, grants you access to all the spells, but it twists the spells in a certain way and doesn't necessarily have the same effect. So yeah, a bit needlessly complicated, but fun. Warlocks are a combination of sorcerer and knight, but they have some of their own particular spells and magical capabilities. I find it best to think of them as being similar to witches.
Fuck. 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 Oh, fuck. Oh, fuck. Fuck.
So they have these magical tricks and things that they can do, but they're it's not as good as the full-on mage. But when it comes to fighting, they're kind of light, mobile fighters, almost in the kind of space that a rogue might take up in a regular game. Now, in the expanded later editions, you get access to additional characters. There's a priest class that you can play. They get some useful abilities, but they're not a cleric. They're not a healing mage or anything of that sort. It really is a more sort of a morale booster more than anything else. But given the default setting is a kind of medieval Europe, then there's a certain authority that comes with being a priest or a monk or a rabbi or whatever else that is eminently exploitable in the social aspects of the game.
Okay, devious! Don't move! The bishop!
You also have Forester, which was a boon to be added. That allows you to play with kind of Robin Hood type characters without hedging a knight or a barbarian. And they also offer up a knave, which is more directly a thief or a rogue, but it's a much more socially oriented rogue. The knave that I've got on my campaign, we've kind of customized by giving them some assassin abilities, and the assassin is another type of class here. But they're slightly magical, slightly mystical. They have limited alchemical capabilities, and are pretty deadly, especially later on once you get access to a thing called a death trance, where you can fixate on your target and then you get ludicrous bonuses if you're attacking that particular target. So it's a simple, easy to use system. A lot of the people that I've been playing with over on Grimstreams haven't had previous experience with the system before these games, but they all picked it up pretty easy. It's pretty simple enough that I can do everything if necessary without having to look up too much stuff outside of specifics. Now, like I said, one of the really big selling points for me was the size of the book, and the new editions don't do that, which is a shame. It's part of the reason I've shifted to using A5 for my books, is I tend to prefer these small, handier formats. Maybe I'll do something at novel size at some point, just for the sake of it, for nostalgia purposes. But the newer version of the game, with all the errata and expanded rules and so on, and all the supplementary material that supports it, that the original never had, it is worth getting, but it just somehow lacks some of the charm that the original books had, and the artistic charm that some of the original books had, the old style illustrations. Of particular note from the original books, I think, is that it contained comic strips to explain how to play the game. That's uncommon, and I don't think anyone else really did that until sort of late era White Wolf, before it collapsed and reformed and collapsed and reformed again. And then they weren't really showing you how the rules worked, whereas the comic strips in Dragon Warriors did show you how the rules worked. So you had the action going on in the panels and then the explanation running alongside, and I thought that was really good and really innovative and really immersive, and really helped make it accessible to people how to play. There was also a very good chapter in the first book, Dragon Warriors, about dungeon tactics. Yeah, things you might not necessarily think of, but because the game was quite deadly, having that same sort of characteristic as low-level D&D games. You know, so level 1 to 6 is about how I would bracket it as being the sort of golden period of D&D play. Those tactics were things you might not necessarily think of, but it was very useful and characterful to have it in that original book, because it helped suggest that you should think tactically and be concerned about how things might go and how much you were exposing yourself to attacks and so on. So that was very interesting and useful and innovative, and really sold the game, I think. What really sells the game for me, though, is the background to the whole thing. The kind of default setting, it isn't named until later on as the Lands of Legend, but it is a very, very British setting. So you could have Arthurian knights fighting alongside, you know, Vikings from the Danelaw, and Robin Hood and Merlin and all of these kind of figures. It really sort of brings together British mythology, British folklore, yeah, the myths and legends that we have, stirs it into a big pot, and it's just really evocative, while it's implicit in the original few books, or when it's explicit, when it's actually setting out that this is the world. I don't know how I can explain how good that is. I'm not the kind of person that thinks that you need to have yourself represented in a book or anything in order to feel a connection, but there is something special from a British point of view about having such an eminently British fantasy setting and game. And also the fact that it is so rooted and steeped in local myths and legends. You know, the stone circles we have. I don't live that far from Stonehenge. There's barrows and Iron Age hill forts and stuff all over the shop, and there's all manner of local legends about ghosts and creatures and whatever, and that's something that the adventures tap into. Many adventures start with you in a village where the locals have stories about some figure living in a local barrow, a green man or a ghost or the wooden man or whatever it might be that stalks the land, or there's a devil in Obsdell, that sort of thing. And it's really evocative, and it really fits the kind of stories that I know from local mythology and stories, about which I guess I'm something of an expert here. And that's just a huge aid for getting into character. D&D has created its own mythology and its own shorthand, and because of its pop cultural success, it has a certain amount of gravity. You know, obviously it drew on things like Jack Vance, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, but it is its own thing, and it's created its own shorthand. You know, if you talk about fantasy RPG, everyone's expecting elves and dwarves and whatever. Not so much in the Lands of Legend, not so much in Dragon Warriors. It's much more humanocentric, but it is grounded in those myths, the Arthurian myths, the Robin Hood, even Dick Turpin. You know, it's much more rooted in that, and that's also a common hook that I think everyone, even Americans, can understand and hook into. So it's tremendously effective in the same way that D&D's familiarity is effective. You know, everyone knows the basic tropes and ideas that go into D&D, and similarly here, from God knows how many bad fantasy movies, B fantasy movies, and a lot of horror films, in many ways Dragon Warriors is more like a horror game, almost, just set in a medieval period. Yeah, that gives people the hook here. People know about Robin Hood. People know about King Arthur, even if it's just from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right? So it has that instant familiarity and that instant capability to play that D&D has, but it comes from a different place and a grounding in real myths and legends. Indeed, while I was originally reading it and playing it when I was a wee nipper, Robin of Sherwood was on TV, and that could be a Dragon Warriors campaign very easily. The kind of low level of magic that's there, but it's there, with mind control and attacking spells and so on, and the band of people who are all humans but who are all independent and different. You know, foresters, knights, barbarians. You could easily make up Robin Hood's band from all that. Even assassins. Good old Will Scarlet. So it is a fantastic game for an old school game, but anyway, just as a game. And it has this hook, it has this grounding in real world mythology, and it's obvious when you read through the books that Dave and Oliver and everyone else who's been involved in it are also grounded in those myths and knowledge of those myths and the history and background of Britain, and it does really come through. Now, you can't get the original edition anymore unless you get particularly lucky on eBay or whatever, but there are PDFs available, there are hard copies available of the other books. It's much more expanded, there's much more options, there's some modernisation that has gone on, most of it to the good. And everyone seems to have who knows about it, seems to have a real love for this game, which really shines through, even in the newer material. But I do miss the smaller format. Dave Morris is a lovely guy. He's been pimping my game that I've been running and talking to me for a while. He was pretty prolific in the Choose Your Own Adventure field back in the day, along with Oliver Johnson and Jamie Thompson, I think, as well as the other guy. He's also been pretty friendly. And just recently he put out another game book with Oliver Johnson again, I think, which was Can You Brexit? Well, I guess time's passed now, but for most people, no, you can't. So it's showing that Choose Your Own Adventure books can be used in more adult and commentary kind of ways. But yeah, all his work is worth a look. Even the Choose Your Own Adventure books, which were much more advanced and mature and had a similar kind of grounding in mythology that Dragon Warriors did. But the new editions are fine too. I can heartily recommend those as well. So it's difficult to rate because we've got basically 2.5 editions. So there's the original paperback series that came out. Then there was a kind of 1.1 edition that James Wallace put out as part of Hogshead or his other company. And then Serpent King Games now has the rights and have put out the main game and a lot of material for it. So which one do I review? Well, the rules haven't changed that much. The content hasn't changed that much. Just the presentation a little. And the presentation is different but not worse in most of the new edition. It's just I have a soft spot and a bias for the old school style of black and white illustration and the presentation in this format. So I'm going to have to sort of rate it considering the game as a whole. Style. It is a very stylistic game. Most of that, however, comes through in the writing and the adventures and the descriptions of the lands of legend. So it's very stylish, but in terms of the information that it presents, how it presents it, the writing, that's where the style is. The old school ones suffer a little from old school problems in terms of production and paper quality and all the rest of it. Newer ones not so much, but all things considered, I think I'd have to give it a style of 4. Substance wise, again, this is difficult to rate because the original books, each one added to the substance, but each one taken individually didn't necessarily contain a huge amount of brilliant information. A lot of it was implicit before it became explicit, but I'm considering it as a whole. So all things considered, with all the additional content in the new editions, if you take the game as a whole, I'm going to have to give it a substance of 4 out of 5 as well, which gives it an overall rating of 4 out of 5 stars. Heartily recommended. Go over to youtube.com/Grimstreams and check out the recent sessions. The games that I run are not performative. I'm not doing it to entertain the audience that might be watching. I'm doing it to entertain the people who are playing, particularly in these times when we're all cloistered. It's to give people an opportunity to get out of their headspace and have some fun and have something to do when they can't get out. But even so, worth a look to see how the game plays and the kind of atmosphere that I'm talking about. But yeah, 4 out of 5 stars, heartily recommended. I'll put a link to the PDFs that you can purchase and download down below if you're watching on YouTube. Take care, everyone. Zang.
Sure, you could play one of those hoity-toity horror games where the most horrifying thing that happens is someone wearing a corset who really shouldn't. Or you could grind a zombie's face into a belt sander.